Our next speaker is Eric Miller. He's a professor at York University, director of the Ecology Footprint Initiative. He teaches ecological economics and sustainability infometrics. He's a David Suzuki Fellow, and he has a background at NRCan and the Ministry of Environment of Canada. And so please welcome Eric Miller all the way from Toronto.
Thanks so much for inviting me to your forum. We'll check to see how the sound goes. It's a little bit almost feedback-ish now, is it? Is it better now? It sounds a little hummy, so anyways, I'll hopefully not drown you out in feedback soon. So we'll just put the slides up there if you can. Wonderful. Thanks again for your invitation. Hold on a sec. Give it a shot. All right. So I'm going to speak about ecological economics for the peninsula and the planet. So you're very familiar in the marketplace of stuff. We're not getting signal here to the slide. Sorry. I'll try more direction. There we go. All right. All right. In the marketplace of stuff, you're well familiar with how to make decisions with competing options and so on. One of the ways you do that is by looking for various signals, information, brands, and so on. You're very familiar with that. Well, there's also in the marketplace of ideas, there's also the same things available. And so in the marketplace of ideas in the realm of economics, there are various brands of economics available for your choosing. Some of them vary with regards to what they focus on, and they also vary with regards to their assumptions about the relationships between the economy and all that around in society and so on. And so in this realm, I'm going to speak about ecological economics. And so there's various ways to define ecological economics. One of the ways to do that is to emphasize that there are sort of three key dimensions of interest to the topic. One of them is sustainability, which might sound surprising that it's not as much of a focus in conventional economics, but it certainly is in ecological economics, especially with regards to its focus on the stewardship of built, human, and natural assets. Natural assets being very important, but often sort of ignored or omitted in a lot of conventional economics. And so it's integrated in that because after all, the stuff that we produce is actually transformed from nature, so it's important to obviously integrate that consideration. We can't produce something from nothing, nor can we produce nothing from something. Obviously, those relationships between the natural assets, the human assets, and the built assets, very important from a stewardship perspective. Ecological economics, like all economists, are interested in efficiency. And when it comes to that, we're talking about getting the most from using the least, and a broad sense of that. We're also interested in distribution as another dimension of analysis that we can do to inform society. And in that realm, it's about who has, who gives, by how much and when, and so on. And so all of these dimensions of sustainability, efficiency, and distribution are important to consider concurrently because that's the case that success in one doesn't necessarily mean success in another dimension. And so we can have efficient outcomes that are not sustainable, etc. And so it's important to keep those minimum of three dimensions in mind, and that's what we as ecological economists offer the world of analysis that can help in each of those three dimensions. And so with the focus of your forum being on climate change, thinking about these three dimensions, certainly in the realm of sustainability, it's about transitioning to a regenerative economy, away from one that is sort of take, make, and dispose to one that is more circular, more regenerative, and one that, being regenerative, also is in better synchronization with limits and linkages and so on. In the realm of efficiency, certainly it's about efficiently reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So making those reductions with the least amount of effort that we need to put into making those reductions so we can maximize our effort to achieve the greatest reductions overall. And certainly in the realm of distribution, about reducing future burdens of today's emissions. And so I'll start with that with some more details to make this sort of apparent to you. So in terms of the distribution and so on, one of the things that we can offer is analysis on the social cost of carbon. And so the social cost of carbon is the estimated future, the value of future damages, net of the benefits emitting an additional unit of carbon dioxide today. And you might wonder, wow, that's quite a challenge to figure that out. And indeed it is, but it has been figured out. This, of course, when we're estimating the social cost of carbon today, it rises over time with rising emissions, since damages grow with accumulated emissions. You're very wise about that, of course. But what economists have done is they've taken climatic models, and from the results from various climatic models, understanding what the consequences are in the future, the consequences with regards to food systems, with regards to energy demand, and so on, understanding all the changes, netting them out in terms of the benefits and costs and changes in the future. On a net basis, they are costs. And then figuring out the value of those net costs in the future, and then deriving a present value equivalent of all those today, because we want to know for each additional unit today, what are the consequences into the future of civilization. So as you can hopefully get a sense, it's very impressive work. And of course, there's various climatic models, so we do that with a whole bunch of models, and we run them with a lot of parameters that we're deeply uncertain about, obviously. So we run them many times, and when we run them within 95% of all the runs, I'll share this with you. But we find that with 95% confidence in the runs of the model, we find the social cost of carbon is somewhere between 140 and 450 Canadian dollars per ton, depending on the assumptions in the models used. A very key assumption, of course, is the equivalence of how much equivalence do we make between a value that's experienced in the future and a value that's experienced today. Nevertheless, with this, the social cost of carbon obviously and intuitively is not zero. It is a positive number, and in this case, certainly that's what we have some sense of. And so with that, that's very helpful information, because when we're figuring out alternatives, plans and actions or inactions that can happen now, it's important to have some kind of metrics to have in mind now when we're doing those calculations and equivalencies and planning for the future, in order to understand and appreciate the consequences of things from a distributional perspective now onto the future of people who we don't know aren't around with us yet. And we can contrast that with the carbon price in a jurisdiction. And obviously the carbon price in a jurisdiction is set through policy, because this is not going to emerge sort of naturally, inherently through market transactions, because the challenge with greenhouse gas emissions, of course, is they're emitted into the common airshed of the whole planet. And so because of that, it's the nature of the problem is where we'd have what we call market failures, where the markets are not able to internalize that into their calculations and so on, because there's no sort of inherent physical limits into access into the atmosphere and so on. Now, fortunately, around the world, governments, our own governments, have taken action to various degrees to try to figure out ways to measure the emissions and also restrict them. Make it so that the atmosphere is not sort of a free dumping ground into that realm. And so that leads into the realm of carbon pricing. We use the expression carbon pricing in a general sense, because there are various ways of doing this. And so there's a direct way of going about carbon pricing and also an indirect way of going about carbon pricing. The direct way is to set very specifically a price on emissions that will affect the quantity of emissions as the price of various things being produced, transported, etc., reflect a greater degree of the costs of that, and that'll affect the quantity of emissions. And so that's where we have experiences like the BC carbon tax and the federal backstop price that we've experienced in Ontario more recently. Whereas in the indirect realm, that's where we're setting a cap on the quantity of emissions, and that affects the price. So the difference between the two things is whether we're targeting the price or targeting the quantity. In either respect, if we design these systems well, we're going to have the intended potential outcomes there of carbon pricing. And so in the indirect way, that's where we're setting a cap on the quantity. That's where we have a cap and trade system, such as what exists in Quebec today and Nova Scotia, and what we had briefly in Ontario for the period some years ago. And now in both cases, both of these approaches makes the price of goods and services more inclusive of the costs of emissions. And that's helpful because, of course, there are so many people involved in so many aspects of everything along the supply chain, everything along the waste chain, and everything else, where the more that we have the prices being reflective of the costs, the more that the various decisions, trade-offs, little tweaks here and there and stuff that they do, the more that they'll be bringing those otherwise externalized costs into their own decision-making. And it's especially important in the business realm and throughout the entire supply chain, where they tend to be very attentive to subtle differences in prices and costs associated with various things. And the great thing with these approaches is that they incentivize ongoing conservation by producers and consumers and investors. So that's the sort of realm of carbon pricing and sort of what it means and what the potential there. And this is certainly very helpful for us and very exciting for us as economists and ecological economists, because this is really in that realm of economic efficiency, of trying to get the most reductions in emissions for the least amount of effort. If we do it by these approaches rather than other approaches where we're being very specific with what are the different ways you have to do things, the approach of this is much better from an efficiency perspective for various reasons. Reflecting on the mayor's comments this morning about what proportion of the planet is taking notice about this and figuring out some way to do carbon pricing. So here's a plot of the share of annual greenhouse gas emissions covered by a pricing system on this planet. And so plotting this over time, it took a while to get going back from the 1990s, so it's about 30 years of history of doing this in the realm of carbon pricing, but certainly in the more recent years, a great uptake in that, including, by the way, just within, since 2021, China's national emissions trading system. And so with the comment about coal-fired generation, this is increasingly being subject to carbon pricing systems around the world. Obviously, there's still much more to be done, but you can see it's ramping up finally, even though it's delayed as to where we ideally would have wanted to see this happen much earlier in time. Here's a plot of looking at that across the planet. More recently, this is the carbon price per ton on the y-axis there, and then on the x-axis we've got the coverage, is the share of a jurisdiction's emissions covered, and we've got the blue dots as the price set directly by the tax or the levy, and then the orange dots as the price from the emissions trading system. In other words, the orange is from the quantity-based approach, the blue is from the price-based approach, and the size of the bubble reflects the amount of emissions covered by that system. So you can see there's a bit of diversity. There are some jurisdictions where it's a very high carbon price per ton, although not necessarily a lot of coverage in that. Any of you want to take a guess, there's a blue dot up at the top, $150 a ton, covering about 40% of that jurisdiction's share of emissions. Hazard a guess? Sweden. Actually, Sweden is one of the earlier jurisdictions to have implemented carbon pricing quite some time ago, and it's actually been very high since the early days, but it's also not very broad in coverage. And so what we want to see is we want to see a growing share of the coverage, the amount of emissions covered by one of these systems. The broader, the better. And then also want to have that carbon price be more reflective of the social costs of carbon. Because even now in Canada, even with the backstop of $50 a ton, as you can appreciate, the cost that we're imposing on the future of humanity is much higher than that. And so even though there is a price, the price is not fully reflective of the costs. And so there's still a gap there. So bottom line conclusions of all this is that, sorry, I missed out on the, just reflecting on that. The carbon price needs to be adequate, comprehensive in coverage, and lasting. And so with that, we'll see the transitions in mobility, electrifying things, or substituting the types of fuels towards ones that are, let's say, biofuels, more regenerative. In the sort of industrial systems and power systems, great amount of optimizations of behind-the-scenes stuff that we're not as familiar with, but of course made huge impacts through the supply chain of stuff around the world. Of course, there's also the consequences down in the residential sector of all sorts of decisions made down to the individual household level of retrofits, trade-offs. Should we do this? Should we do that? Well, what's the payoff of this versus that, and so on. Also using different materials, different ways of formulations of things like concrete and other durables and so on, materials, effects across landscapes, what it is that we're planting, how we're tilling or not tilling, and so on, as reflected in the climate plan I was just reading earlier. And even also paying attention to the inefficiency of the leaks and so on throughout gas distribution systems. Huge amount of leaks there, but of course, if the leaks sort of have a zero price consequence, more or less, other than someone, not being able to use as much of the gas that was produced. Still, if we're actually pricing those leakages, which are very consequential from a climate perspective, because if you're leaking methane, each unit of methane, even higher implications from a climate change perspective than the equivalent unit of leakage of carbon dioxide. Huge effects there. So with all this, though, of course, especially in your realm and those of you in the natural science and landscape sort of planning realm and so on, you're probably hearing stuff about nature-based solutions. And you're probably hearing about getting to net zero emissions. And so the idea of net zero emissions is that we want to get to the point of having it that all the emissions that we emit within a year on this planet are sufficiently absorbed in that same year so that we're not adding to an accumulation of emissions in the atmosphere, because it's the accumulation that generates the problem. So we've got to stop accumulating the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And so in the realm of nature-based solutions to get there, there's all sorts of ideas that get people quite excited. The most common one I find is planting trees, right? I mean, we can be against planting trees. Lots of interest in planting trees. The federal government's talking about planting 2 billion trees. I think the provincial government's keen on planting trees. Companies, individuals, everyone's interested in planting trees. Okay, so that's interesting. Of course, the question is sort of where are we going to plant all these trees, obviously. They've got to be planted somewhere. Now, of course, they could be planted in, especially a bit further south where there's a longer growing season, and they can soak up a lot of carbon emissions per unit of area. But actually, in those parts of, especially southern parts of Ontario, well, there's also interest in having more ethanol mixed into Ontario's gasoline supply, and we've got now 10% of the mixture now is from ethanol. Well, it's Ontario's homegrown fuel. Indeed, of course, where are we growing that fuel? Well, it's on agricultural lands and so on. So that's those lands that are providing us with biofuels can't be providing us with afforestation possibilities at the same time. Now, we're also interested in building with more renewable materials. So you can build taller buildings now than we have before through great innovations in engineering associated with wood products. So you can have taller buildings made out of wood rather than steel and aluminum, which is very energy and emissions intensive, etc. Now, of course, at the same time, we've got all this, all of our physical assets, all of our infrastructure and stuff that's been laid out over the land. So obviously, you can't be doing that on that part. Plus, we've still got to eat and so on, and there's more of us expected and so on. So we put all this stuff together, and we should hopefully appreciate that when we're thinking about especially landscape-related solutions to get to net zero emissions, there's all sorts of possibilities, but there are constraints as well. And the constraints relating to just, the amount of area available and where that is, etc. And, oops. All right, that wasn't part of the original plan, but anyways, there we go. And so with this, we need area-based accounting of possibilities and trade-offs. And so that leads into my point, as was mentioned in the introduction. I'm associated with the Ecological Footprint Initiative at York University. And so the ecological footprint is the area that's needed to sustain the provision of food to us and to our pets and to other animals that we eat as humans, plus the area to provide us with fibers and materials there, plus the areas to provide us with things like timber, great forest products, paper, and all that sort of stuff. Plus being mindful of the area that we've already occupied through cities and infrastructure and so on. Plus being inclusive of all the emissions that are generated by human activity. And so we can put all this together so we can say the ecological footprint is the area needed to sustain the consumption of renewable resources, settlements, and carbon emissions. And so there's various ways that we detail the ecological footprint. We detail it in terms of various units related to land cover and land use. And when it comes to the carbon component, what we do is, in the accounting, we've got statistics of all of our anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide. From that, a certain portion, about 25%, believe it or not, is absorbed on an annual basis by the oceans across the planet, the oceans and the life within them. And then the rest is available potentially to be sequestered by terrestrial means. Now, there's various ways to soak up carbon across the landscape, as many of you I'm sure are familiar with. On a the most space-efficient way to do that is through forests. It's not to say that there aren't other ways to do it through, different ways of cropping through grasslands, etc. Obviously through wetlands and etc. But on the space-efficient way, the most space-efficient way to do that through forests. So what we do is we measure the area of forests that are needed to soak up all those emissions that are not soaked up by the oceans in that calendar year. And so that's how we're able to integrate the emissions together with also the land area requirement for the food, the building materials, and so on. And so that's what an ecological footprint is. It's composed of those various elements, and that can be compared to the biocapacity, which is the area available to sustain us on this planet or in any part of this planet as well. And we can measure the components of biocapacity in the same way using the same components of land use and land cover. And so with that, we can actually measure both in the same units of a global hectare. And that's important because if we want to measure the biocapacity as the potential to sustain an ecological footprint, or conversely, for an ecological footprint, how much biocapacity is needed. That way we can measure the two in the same units there. Now, in 2018, this is what the scale looked like. The ecological footprint was much in excess of biocapacity. The amount that we're demanding from landscapes can't be supplied to us within just one calendar year. We at York University, we generated these numbers by integrating about 47 million rows worth of data from various global data sources, and we put them together in what we call National Ecological Footprint and Biocapacity Accounts. So I'm fortunate to have a great team of students there that we train up in sustainability informatics using computing techniques and so on to work with a lot of big data sets. And what we do in these accounts is we generate accounts for all countries on the planet from the 1960s to the present. Countries, and on a country-specific basis, we have all sorts of details about the ecological footprint and biocapacity within that country at that moment or within that calendar year. And then from all this, we can sum them up to get a world total, and that's what I'll show you here. So here's, on a world basis, the ecological footprint divided by biocapacity in each of the years from 1961 to 2018. And so this is what the trend has been. There's been a growing ecological footprint relative to the biocapacity on the planet since then, such that we've been in global overshoot for quite a while where the ecological footprint is in excess of biocapacity. The consequences, obviously, I'm sure you're familiar with that. Accumulation of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, a degradation of the capacity of the lands and waters to provide us with ongoing flows of goods and services that we use to sustain us. And so this is what it looks like on a planetary perspective. We generate accounts on a national basis. And I'll just say that when we're thinking about the future, it's important to be sort of thinking, reflecting not just on what has been the trend, but also to think ahead into the future. So thinking ahead to 2050, Canada is one of 120 countries that have committed to net zero emissions. And essentially what that means from this accounting approach that we use is that means getting from where we are now to the point of having ecological footprint within biocapacity. Because that means that by the year 2050, all the emissions that we emit as humans in that year could be sequestered by the lands and waters across the planet in that year, so there's no net additional increment of emissions over time. And so that's what net zero emissions is. And from a footprint and biocapacity perspective, it means getting to that ratio of 1, where the ecological footprint is within the biocapacity of the planet at that point in time. So, where do we stand? So a little bit of background on where we are in Canada. Canada, we've got a lot of areas, you know. In terms of the area in hectares, we can convert that to global hectares as an equivalent unit of measure, where we evaluate for each of the hectares of a certain type of land, what's the equivalent amount of global hectares from a biocapacity perspective. The lands and waters in Canada were northern, and so the growing seasons is shorter than the world average in many respects, and so for each of the components we can make an equivalence in terms of global hectares to understand the biocapacity in global hectares, which helps us to compare that to our ecological footprint in the same units and so on. About 75% worth of the biocapacity that is offered on all lands and waters from Canada is used up in our ecological footprint of production. So the ecological footprint of all the stuff that we do in that calendar year in Canada at that moment. Now you might be familiar, or maybe not, that about a third of all the stuff that we produce in Canada is consumed in the rest of the world. And about a third of all the stuff that we consume in Canada is produced in the rest of the world. So there's a high degree of trade between us and Canada and the rest of the world, more so than in other countries like in the United States, where that ratio is much smaller. And so with that, it's very important to also account for not just the ecological footprint of all the stuff that was produced in this country, but also the ecological footprint embodied within all the trade flows. And so that's another thing that we do. And so we actually have the ecological footprint measured as embodied within imports and exports, and then from that we can derive the ecological footprint of consumption. As you can see, the ecological footprint embodied within Canada's exports is much higher than that embodied within imports. Perhaps that's not surprising, right? We are, as a country, we export a lot of 2x4s to the States, and then we import Netflix specials and software patents and pharmaceutical patents and so on too, right? You can see from an ecological footprint perspective, the use of the lands and the waters is not equivalent between imports and exports. And so this means that as we in Canada are working on getting to net zero emissions, it's all the more critical for us to figure that out, because that certainly relates much more to all that we produce. We're importing footprint light stuff, we're exporting footprint intensive stuff, and so it's really important on us to to make that transition here, because and also appreciate that the rest of the world depends on our success or lack thereof in Canada. At the same time, of course, that we are going to be relying upon the rest of the world also to be making changes and making it so that our imports are less footprint intensive to get to that ratio of 1. That's what it looks like on a national basis. We have also figured out what the accounts look like for Ontario. And so a publication from just a year ago, Ontario's Ecological Footprint and Biocapacity, Measures and Trends from 2005 to 2015. You can find this on the internet. It's published through the Ontario Biodiversity Council. We did this as a research group for the Ontario government, for the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. And so from that we assessed each one of the pixels on the landscape in Ontario, what's the biocapacity provided by that landscape? And how does that compare to the ecological footprint of all the consumption that took place in Ontario in that year, and how do they compare? Here's a plot of Ontario's ecological footprint in 2015 as compared to the biocapacity in 2015, which in the Ontario case was the more recent years that we had in there, because their State of Ontario's biodiversity reporting was interested in that time period, and so that's we derived the metrics for both of those. And so, I mean, this is, to me, I think it's quite astounding that the ecological footprint of all of our consumption in Ontario is equivalent to the biocapacity provided by the entire province of Ontario. I'm always shocked by that because I probably have experience like you have, this sense that, wow, there's a lot of Ontario. If you've ever taken a train trip out west and you pass by a long time going through Ontario, you're like, wow, there's a lot of area in Ontario. There is. But that's how much area is needed to sustain us on an ongoing basis, especially from a carbon perspective. I find it quite astounding that the capacity of forests, even if we didn't consume any forest products from Ontario's forests, there still wouldn't be enough forest area to soak up all of our emissions in Ontario currently, or as of 2015. So obviously, not surprising, as with your own climate plan that I was just looking at this morning, the first step in that, the first action, right, is cut consumption, right? We need to reduce emissions, we need to reduce our other uses of lands and waters, obviously, to get towards that ratio, but I find that quite astounding. Now, Ontario has a lot of wetlands, a lot of peatlands, a lot of boglands, especially in the northern part of Ontario, and so we actually included an estimate for on an annual basis, the sequestration of all that. There's lots of land there. It doesn't, on a per area basis, it doesn't soak up as much carbon as the average hectare of forest in Ontario, but still we integrated that into the accounts, and that's that purple component of the wetland carbon uptake, along with the error bars, because there's not too many samples in the literature that we found, and there are certain margins within that based on the observed data varying a bit year to year, and so that's what that bar sort of refers to. So that's what it looks like for Ontario. Now, of course, obviously in Ontario, so much of that consumption takes place in the south of the province. It's very concentrated. Whereas we can appreciate that, you know, the amount of area needed beyond all those urban areas to support them. And so that's what I'll share with you now, a little bit of an image here of a municipality to the south of us. You might not know what this is unless you're a real cartographic nerd, knowing what the cities look like in that. This is the city of Mississauga, okay? And I've sized the city of Mississauga in relation to the biocapacity of lands and waters within its municipality as compared to its ecological footprint. And so this whole slide is its ecological footprint, and then the size of the city of Mississauga is in relation to its biocapacity. Not surprisingly, the city of Mississauga, for all the consumption activities within a calendar year, requires the equivalent of 50 more units of area equivalent to the size of Mississauga to support its flows, to support its metabolism on that basis. And this is what the components of ecological footprint look like. And so with the orange component, for example, the amount of cropland area across the planet needed to sustain Mississauga's consumption of things from crops and so on. The forest product area in the green. And then the rest of this, with the black background, is the area needed to soak up carbon emissions from Mississauga in the course of 1 year. Now that's a lot of area. Of course, that area is way beyond, as I said, not surprisingly, of the city, because cities are concentrations of people and metabolism and so on, drawing upon the areas far beyond them. But of course, underlying the important, the relationships and the dependencies there and how that affects more broadly. Now this part is the component of the ecological footprint that cannot be accommodated within that year. So this is the overdraw. This is the overshoot. And so this is the contribution to the accumulation of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, etc., as I mentioned before. So now in this case, I mean, thinking about the lands and waters, especially in this part of Ontario, obviously lots of biocapacity offered here to the rest of Ontario, to the rest of the world, and so hence the importance of the appreciation and the relationships and so on being established or being recognized that way. And so that's also part of this, is to engage people around the world, and especially you can just engage people across Ontario, that whether you're able to see the beauty of Ontario's landscapes as you do, as most of you I'm sure do here, or not, or whether one looks out the window and sees a brick wall of an adjoining unit and so on, which is more the view kind of where I live, to still really appreciate those metabolic relationships that we have with lands and waters, obviously, and that we've got to get that right. So I'll sort of wrap up this with maybe a big question, which is an important question to ask and answer, especially in the political realm, and the economics plays a role in that. And what should we aim to maximize or minimize? It's a big question. It's a question that we don't usually ask and answer directly, but we kind of indirectly answer it. And you can see through various election campaigns and various punditry and so on that there's sort of a lot of presumptions of the answers to this. And very often the answer defaults to this. Well, when in doubt, maximize gross domestic product, GDP. You've probably heard about that acronym. There's a lot of media coverage towards GDP, especially these days, but almost always the time. It's gone up a few points, or if it's gone down in 2 quarters. That's technically a recession and so on. There's a number of challenges with focusing so heavily on gross domestic production. It's an aggregate measure that sums up in monetary terms the monetary value of all the stuff that was exchanged and produced in the market economy in a certain time period, net of certain trade flows and so on. The challenge there is that, well, one is that there's a lot of stuff that's exchanged in the market economy where if we weren't doing that, it would be okay. It's not like every unit of an exchange is necessarily beneficial. I mean, imagine, especially cleaning up after disasters. I mean, we wouldn't necessarily want to have disasters, and so it's not like, we necessarily want to purposely make ourselves busy just to be doing things and building and rebuilding and so on. There's also a lot of stuff that is good for us that we want to maximize that is not captured within the GDP because it's not market in nature. Think of a lot of stuff that provides you with a great quality of life here in this part of Ontario that is not market in nature. When you engage in your great potlucks amongst your neighbors and so on, you're not charging each other for the food, right? You're bringing the food there. There's not a lot of market activity that takes place, but sure, there's a lot of good value that's produced as part of that. So that's also not captured as well. And of course, this is capturing just on the basis of the prices that are paid for things. As I was talking about before, there's a lot of costs that are externalized onto others that aren't included in the prices of things that we pay. And so that's also another limitation with this. And so for many decades, economists of all flavors, especially ecological economists, have been sort of trying to temper the world with its enthusiasm for paying so much attention so much attention to maximizing gross domestic production. So instead of maximizing gross domestic production, what are some other metrics that we should think about maximizing or minimizing? Well, what about some other metrics that are used a lot in talked a lot in punditry and politics and so on? What about maximizing jobs and minimizing GHGs? Surely, right? We want to minimize greenhouse gas emissions, and in the process of doing so, we want to have people included as that. The reason why jobs are important, not so much the job as an end in itself, but it's a means of earning income, participating in society, and so on. So, okay, so let's think about this. Well, one of the things that I find sort of remarkable is when we're reflecting on transitioning to a more regenerative economy is sort of the presumptions of what are the things that yield jobs and how emissions intensive those things are. And so I thought just as some sort of examples here, if we're contrasting mega project construction to repair construction, which I think is an appropriate comparison, especially in Ontario, further south to here, there's a lot of enthusiasm by some to build new highways to some places because potentially in the future there might be, some returns from that and so on. Well, okay, there's a lot of money potential, a lot of effort, a lot of resources being directed potentially towards mega highway building, mega project construction, and so on. Well, is that the only thing we could think of as humans at this moment in time when we're talking about the need to retrofit all of our existing built stuff and so on? Well, what about repair construction? Well, to get $1 million of each of the sector's outputs, I've got some statistics here for you, and maybe I'll just ask the AV person maybe to take off my video because it might block some of the numbers I'm going to show. Thanks. So in this realm, opposite version of that, sort of just the slides, not me, thanks. If you can put my slides back. There you go, thanks so much. Wonderful, okay, so to get $1 million of a sector's output from each of those, This is how many full-time equivalent jobs there are in that sector. There's more full-time equivalent jobs in repair construction than mega project construction. Not surprisingly, there's more labor-intensive in repair construction than there is in mega project construction. Now, of course, repair construction relies on using tools that are generated by the manufacturing sector and so on. And so you can appreciate the interlinkages throughout the economy from any sector's outputs. There's all the other sectors that input into it. And so Statistics Canada has really great input-output accounts that track the interrelationships throughout the entire supply chain. So we know for each unit of an output from one sector what all the contributions are from all the other sectors in the economy. So from that, we can derive the full-time equivalent jobs in Canada throughout the indirect relationships through that. We can also look at the tons of greenhouse gases emitted in Canada. This is all data from Statistics Canada. This is not my own personal research. I just took some numbers off the shelf, off the internet, and I'm going to also provide you with a ratio. The tons of greenhouse gases emitted per full-time equivalent job in Canada, mega project construction, 50 units of greenhouse gas emissions per full-time equivalent job versus 24 in the realm of repair construction. Some people find this kind of surprising because they usually think sort of mega project construction is a jobs-intensive thing. No, it's emissions-intensive, and there's not a lot of jobs per unit of that as compared to other things because it's heavily mechanized, right? There's big machines that a few people are driving that are very metabolic, very transformative landscapes, but not as labor-intensive. How about this? Contrasting oil and gas extraction in nursing and residential care. Well, there's quite a stark comparison between the two. Wow, we got 483 units of greenhouse gas emissions per full-time equivalent job in Canada from oil and gas extraction as compared to 5 tons of greenhouse gas emissions per full-time equivalent job in Canada from nursing and residential care. Again, you say, well, nursing residential care, of course, is consuming paper products, it's consuming fossil fuel and plastics and all that sort of stuff. Yes, it is, and that's included in these numbers because of the direct and indirect relationships through these numbers from Statistics Canada. So all this to say, of course, if we're interested in jobs and minimizing greenhouse gas emissions, I think part of it is also sort of appreciating through greater economic literacy of the distinctions between the various sectors in the economy and the stuff that's jobs intensive and the stuff that's emissions intensive, and putting it together in economic analysis so that we're not so fixated not only just on GDP, but even in the realm of jobs and greenhouse gas emissions, to be more mindful of that. And so again, with this fundamental question of sort of what should we aim to maximize or minimize, we might even think more broadly than that and realize, of course, as I said, jobs are, of course, is a means to an end. There's about work to do something that's hopefully useful and hopefully rewarding. Well, what is the ultimate ends that we're really after? What are the sort of more fundamental units of things we should maximize and minimize? And so, as an economist, I love ratios, as you can probably find out already from this presentation. So, here's a final ratio to leave you with. And so, to me, we should maximize this ratio. The ratio of human well-being in the numerator with the denominator of the human metabolism of ecosystems. The more that we can reduce our metabolism of ecosystems with a given amount of human well-being, the better. The more that we can, for the amount of metabolism that we do, the more that we can increase well-being from all that activity, the better too. And so in this ratio, you can maximize this ratio by minimizing the denominator and growing the numerator. Now this is a pretty high level, but actually we can be more specific than this. Maximizing the ratio of long lives, equitably lived, with a high life satisfaction, divided by ecological footprint, subject to sustaining biocapacity. Now that's a bit more of an elaborated ratio there, but I hope you can sort of appreciate in that sort of what's meant by that. And so that, I think, is something that we should keep in mind as we're thinking about the future in a general sense. Again, challenging all those who are caught up in one specific metric and versus another and so on, to ask those foundational questions of what should we aim to maximize or minimize when we're thinking about all the stuff that we do collectively through institutions, through political processes and so on, but also even at the level of households, at the level of your relationships and that sort of thing. And so I provided with you some information about ecological footprint. You're probably well familiar with longevity data and minimizing mortality rates and all that sort of stuff. That's kind of conventional. But in the realm of high life satisfaction, you may or may not be surprised to know that there's a lot of statistics about that. There's a lot of data that's been collected around the world and in Canada about life satisfaction. And there's various ways to capture that by metrics, but the usual way is by asking people the question, which I won't repeat the full question, but it's to the effect of, on a 10-point scale, with 10 being the highest and 0 being the lowest, where do you find yourself, generally speaking, on that spectrum of life satisfaction? And so people answer that, and of course with data about their age and other circumstances and stuff, we can integrate it, and there's a lot of great researchers that have done that. And so in the same way that I direct the Ecological Footprint Initiative at York University, there's great research teams around the world, one of which is this research team that produces the World Happiness Reports, led by John Helliwell. That's very, auspicious as a last name Well. Having Well in your last name, I guess, went on to be quite a good scholar in the realm of well-being and so on. And so you can engage in this, and they've done all kinds of interesting analysis where they tie the information together to make us more enlightened about what it is that provides us with high life satisfaction. What are the things that challenges us? To what extent are we able to rebound or not? What are the things that provide us of sort of resilience, assurance, insurance, and that sort of thing in that realm? And so I'll just share this as a final image here. The national average self-reported life satisfaction, the most recent data available. You can aggregate it on a national basis. Now, of course, keeping in mind when you aggregate stuff on a national basis, it's not talking about the distribution within the nation. But with that data, you can look at the distribution of life satisfaction within the nation based on age and circumstances and where and so on. But just going down the list there, on the one hand, we're relatively favorable that we're in amongst the top countries from a life satisfaction perspective, but we are 15. And so we've got ways to be better. And sadly, reporting that our life satisfaction today is less than it was many years ago. And that decline even happened before the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic was challenging the world over, but in Canada, the average aggregated life satisfaction has been declining more recently, and also the variance of it amongst the Canadian population has been growing. So the amount of dispersion in the answer for those who are really not doing very well versus those who are doing well, there's more dispersion over time. So the distribution of just about everything is getting more skewed, including the ultimate ends of life satisfaction. And so in this realm then, Canada number 15, life satisfaction, on average, on a 10-point scale, the average person statistically representative of Canada would answer somewhere around 7 on that, 7 out of 10. Now what's really cool that these researchers have done is they've taken all this data around the world and they've integrated it with all other things that are measured nationally across the planet on a national basis in each of these countries. And so they've related it statistically to the components because they're interested in the question of, well, what contributes to life satisfaction? And so that's what they've done. And so if you're wondering what the various colors are on this bar, they all represent different contributions of things to statistically to generating that answer that the average Canadian will provide. And this is the component, this is the proportion that's attributable to GDP per capita. It's not nothing, but surely it's not the big story, right? The rest of this is about the degree of social supports that we have. Our health, the freedom to make life choices, the generosity of others, the trust in others, the perception that there's low corruption overall within our communities and in our societies, and various other factors. Now, of course, I probably don't need to elaborate much more on this. You probably have some sense of this, and that's what I've really remarked in the last day or so that I've been able to enjoy a little bit of Tobermory. When you talk about the great potlucks that you have throughout the winters and the great, the activities are always going on, the extent to which you can count on your neighbors and others, you have trust in others and so on, that's what provides you with a high life satisfaction. You know it, of course, but we in the economics community are finally getting to appreciate that. And so as much as perhaps maybe a bit of a message to the mayor, as much as maybe the rest of Ontario might say, well, what's Tobermory's contribution to the GDP of Ontario or Canada? You can answer back, well, let me tell you about life satisfaction here, because that's what our product is here. So anyways, with that, thanks so much for your interest in this, and I'll just round off with these sort of concluding comments. The theme of your few days here is the climate is changing, will we? Well, I think we will if we choose ecological economics to inform sustainability and efficiency and equity, make carbon pricing, indeed all prices, more reflective of costs, and make pricing adequate, comprehensive, and lasting, and do the math and planning on using nature-based solutions to help achieve net zero emissions. So it's not just someone say, oh, we'll do this and we'll do that. Well, okay, let's do the math on that, put it together and see what the possibilities and constraints are, rather than just believing that we can just ad hoc sort of believe all these things and somehow magically, hopefully they'll add up. Reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a broader context of reducing our ecological footprint. We're focused on climate, focused on greenhouse gas emissions, but that's not the only thing that's really important with our relationships with lands and waters around us and beneath us. And most importantly, let's look beyond GDP to target better measures of economic and societal performance. Thank you.
I think we do have a couple of minutes for questions, so do we have any questions from the audience? There's one from Brian here. Yeah, I'll answer. I think you've all heard the question. Hopefully I'll just answer here in case of the recording or something. Yeah, a couple of thoughts on that. So one is that in our initiative, the Ecological Footprint Initiative at York, we've just started a collaboration with the Rural Ontario Institute, where they're interested in the questions for the non-Mississauga areas of Ontario, and especially on like what are the natural assets within various regional municipalities, cities, parts of landscapes and so on in Ontario, to have it at that sub-provincial scale, kind of like what I showed for Mississauga. So we're embarking on that, so we'll hopefully have some empirics on that to be able to answer some of the questions of, like in this part of Ontario, for example, what are the, of the natural assets that exist and that you're managing, what does that mean in terms of sustaining people around Ontario or the rest of the planet? And so we'll be able to have some answers for that maybe in the coming year. So I guess stay tuned for that. I'm sorry, we as our initiative, we're not as, we're so focused on our research, we're not the best at marketing and stuff, so we haven't even, well, anyways, we don't even have like a sign-up list on email to if you want to hear more from us, but in the meantime, you can always contact us at, or contact me or contact us at footprint.info.yorku.ca, or you can just Google Ecological Footprint York University. Eventually you'll come to us. And so let us know, and then we can stay in touch because we're building that better infrastructure to inform you. And then on the second point, to your question on the economics, not the politics, but the economics of like sort of sorting out the challenge where, all the benefits of the natural assets are going to flow to other people who will
be able to, of course, enjoy them and it'll sustain them. But because they're non-market in nature, there's not necessarily a payment for that. And so what can you do about that? Well, there's various potentials of things that can be done. One of the things that has interested a lot of people in Ontario for some time is sort of things like payments for ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are the benefits that flow to us from natural assets. The challenge with that is the benefits flow to us regardless of payments, of course, because they flow to us freely across landscapes. And that's okay. We're not meant to be sort of somehow privatizing them or going around collecting for them, but we can recognize, for example, that if you've got a certain amount of land, let's say here in Ontario, and trying to figure out how to optimize the value of that land, if you're only responding to market prices of things that are bought and sold in the marketplace, your management of the land is going to be different than if you also have the possibility to have payments for ecosystem services as well. Because you could say, okay, well, this part of the land actually doesn't provide a lot of commercial revenue, but it provides a lot of public good revenue potentially. And so there's some potential there through things like payments for ecosystem services mechanisms, and there's a lot of interest across Ontario on that. Several years ago, when I worked for the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, I started up the work on ecosystem services, quantifying them, understanding how they flow across landscapes and so on. So I would say expect to see maybe more of that in the future.
Well, thanks so much, Eric. Don't go away. Yeah, we're kind of running out of time, so I think we're going to call it, because if we go to questions for everybody all the time, we'll never get the conference done. So talk to Eric after the or during the break. When I introduced Eric, I said that he was a David Suzuki Fellow. And one thing that occurred to me is I've heard David Suzuki say many times how terrible economists are, because all they concentrate on is GDP. And what I learned today is that no, economists also concentrate on potlucks, and that is great, and I'm going to value my next potluck a lot more than I have in the past. So thank you very much.